last time we talked about your rather extensive educational background, and today I want to ask you about your political journey. So, my question
Ah,
first: were your parents politically active when you were young? What role did they play in your political views?
I think they actually did play an interesting role. They were both Goldwater Republicans, so we're talking about the campaign of 1964. And they were really active, and they were deeply suspicious of the emergent left. My father and my mother both eventually left all partisan attachments and just became purely independents. But I remember when I was young, there were several moments that I gave me a sense of political independence. So when I was in public school, Watergate was going on, and it was almost a required belief to think of Richard Nixon as a terrible criminal who had spoiled the office of the presidency and had done terrible things, and we were given propaganda, in the form of a weekly newspaper called the Weekly Reader, as I recall, that just railed against Nixon. It's like, oh, what has he done to the presidency and everything? You can just imagine, the way, I don't know, something like Vox or the New York Times talks about Trump today. You know, we've got a pristine office, and this bad man has invaded it. We've got to get rid of him. So that was every day, and but my parents didn't feel that way. They felt like Nixon wasn't a perfect person, but he was being railroaded essentially by the center left establishment, which I mean is probably true. And I remember there was a vote in my classroom where the teacher asked, and I'm talking about like third or fourth grade here, or maybe earlier, yeah, maybe third grade, asked, how many people think Nixon is guilty, and every single hand in the classroom went up except mine, and they said, who thinks he's innocent? I raised my hand, and the teacher just came down on me. Here I'm just this little kid. What do I know? And she's like, "Oh, this is an outrage. That you would defend Nixon. Haven't you been reading, the Weekly Reader and listening to me? And why are your opinions unconventional?" What I mean? So, and so I guess my politics were a little bit tweaked in that direction already. My best friend, Victor Rede, who lived across the street, we hung out just all the time before tribalism, kicked in later. But his parents were dedicated Democrats, and I remember wondering, like, why are my parents Republicans and his parents are Democrats, and thinking of it as a kind of a different tribe, and then asking my parents one time what the difference was between the two. I mean, it's kind of an interesting question. I think probably it occurs to everybody at a young age. What's the difference between the two? And they could never give me a coherent answer. Actually, it was just like, well, we're us and they're them. So much later, in high school, I started reading Rand and getting a little more philosophically sophisticated. I went through a brief period of partisan republicanism during the 1984 election, where I have a vague memory of having some flyers for Ronald Reagan and passing them out to somebody, which in retrospect is deeply embarrassing to me. I mean, I can't believe I actually did that. It's mortifying. But at the time, all my professors were, either, somewhere center left, somewhere between center left and communist. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. And being propagandized like that every day in the classroom, kind of tends to drive you, at least for me, it drove me in the opposite direction. But I think it was only a year after Reagan was elected. This is where people make a mistake. When you develop expectations for a candidate, then he wins. They will definitely be shattered, right? So it was about a year after Reagan won that I saw. I mean, it's like the mirage just disappeared, and I got angry. Actually, I got angry at politics and angry at Reagan, angry at the Republican establishment, and I realized they were just all kind of tricking me. And then it was about that same year that I moved to Washington. and started journalism school. And I got to report from the Senate Press Gallery. I got to know all the right-wing conservative leadership on Capitol Hill, and I came to realize the entire thing was a scam. It became very obvious to me that it was just a town of decadence and money and clamoring for power, and that all the propaganda spilling out of this place was just designed for mass consumption, but had nothing to do with reality. And I wrote this to my grandmother, actually. I remember writing her a long letter, just something like, because I adored her, and I told her, I said, listen, I can just tell you, just don't believe anything that you're being told. It's all nonsense. Everything that's happening on the Beltway, it's all about power and money. It's not really about you, and it's not about idealism. It's not about improving the country. It's not about anything. It's just a terrible racket. I wonder what this older lady must have thought getting a note like that from a 23-year-old kid. I don't really know, but that step towards political independence is a difficult one, really, and not everybody can take it, really. It takes some. You have to begin to think for yourself, reject all the categories you read in most all media, and step out and form your own opinions. And I think that's in some ways a more important step than just becoming a libertarian, in a sense, because once you realize you don't have to be shaped by the dominant civic culture, then you can be prepared for really becoming a thoroughgoing classical liberal, anarchist libertarian, or whatever it is you end up as. But the first step has to be to detach yourself from the prevailing norms of the civic culture.
Now, you were born and raised in Texas, right?
Yes.
What was it like growing up in Texas?
Well, I grew up, I moved several times. My family had moved to Southwest Texas in 1830, so they were involved in, God bless them all, but they were involved in 3 separate purges, demographic purges of Texas. One to make safe passage for German, Scottish, and Irish immigrants, and so therefore keep the Apaches at bay. The second one to kick Mexico out of Texas and to claim it as their own. And then the third one was, of course, the great war of northern aggression. So 3 separate wars, all designed to clear Texas out of the undesirables. So that's my family. That's my history, and there's some brave souls among them, and I love them. But it's kind of a grim history when I read about it. So it was a frontier family, and then after World War II, my family owned a lot of land in the Middle and Odessa region, and after World War II, this land moved from ranching to of course oil, and so it was a oil family on my mother's side, and law and accounting, sort of professional white collar family on my father's side, and both sides of my family have been in Texas since the early 19th century. So there's deep heritage there. I was really raised on the border in a demographically mixed community. Very much in those days, there was no real effective border between Texas and Mexico. We just treated it as Juarez as the town next door, really. And yeah, there were tensions and difficulties, of course, as there would be in any kind of growing population that's a little bit unsettled. On the other hand, it was thoroughly integrated, you know, and that was the world I grew up in, and I still carry it around with me today, and I'm absolutely mystified by all the ethnic conflict that's present in the world today. I've always thought of ethnic conflict as being I don't know, some kind of excuse for some other problem you have in your life, and if things aren't going very well for you, you turn inwards and say, who am I? What am I made of? You know, what's my biology consist in? And isn't that my primary reality and source of value in life? So it's kind of a pathetic concession to hopelessness in a sense. And I think that's kind of what's begun to happen in our country, which I think is really regrettable.
How did you come to know Murray Rothbard, and is it true that you have some of his bow ties?
I do. I have two of his bow ties. One given by. I have to rethink that a second. I was going to say one given to me by Murray, but actually, in fact, both of them were given to me by Joey, who is his widow, since deceased. So yeah, it was. I was at a conference in California, and I had been assigned the role to pick up Murray from the airport as a kind of a gopher, and I had read his book when I was in college, and so you develop an impression of an author, and I guess I imagined him as a kind of a a tall, mighty person. I don't know why tall, but a kind of a fierce temperament, a towering, slightly terrifying intellectual. And so when I picked him up at the airport, I was shocked to find a man that's like a foot shorter than I, and full of giggles, like uncontrollably giggling about everything. I mean, his whole attitude towards basically all of life, meaning all of life, was to find hilarity in it and to find joy in it. And he just never stopped. Everything that happened it was fascinating to him. He was tremendously vocal, never stopped making jokes, not so much witty jokes, but just like delight, just a sense of delight. And it was infectious. I mean, everybody around him began to absorb it. I don't know if you've ever been around a person like that, who just kind of like compels everybody around him to be happy. And that's kind of what Murray did, and that's, I think, why everybody enjoyed being around him. But I struck up a fast friendship with him, and I don't really understand how this happened, because during all those years, I knew him for 10 years, between 1985 and his death in 1995. We talked on the phone maybe once or twice a week, and in those days, I mean, that was before the internet, so, nowadays you text somebody for permission to call, may I call, In those days, you just called, and you didn't even know who was necessarily calling, and so I would call him at strange times, and it was always Joey who answered the phone, and she'd say, "Oh, hi Jeffrey, let me get Murray," and she'd put him on, and we'd talk, and I don't know, these conversations would last like an hour, or sometimes even two, and he never seemed to be in a rush. It was always I who ended the conversation with, "Well, I'll let you go, Murray," and he'd say, "Okay, Jeffrey." And looking back at it, I'm slightly mortified, like, how many articles did I prevent him from writing? I mean, how many books could he have written during the time that I wasted his time on the phone? I don't understand why he was so indulgent towards me.
What historical events most impacted you as an author?
It's funny, because I was a terrible writer in college, actually. I don't know why I couldn't write. You know why I couldn't write in college? And think about it, suddenly I just realized I answered my question. It's because I didn't know who to be. This stops a lot of writers, this sense of fear that you're going to come across as somebody, and you don't know who that is supposed to be for whom. Because most of us are different people in different aspects of our lives. I mean, we're sons and daughters. We're fathers and mothers. We're one way to our pastor at the church, one way to our siblings, and so on. Another way to our professors. The thing about writing is it scares us, because when you write, you're only one person to everybody who reads it, or you can only present yourself in one way, and you don't know how that's going to be interpreted by the world. So I think this actually stops people from being good writers. I later started writing a lot because I desperately had things to say, essentially, and nobody else was saying them, and I wanted to be the guy to say it. So I guess the thing that really drove me into writing was all the ways in which I saw government kind of messing up life in big and small ways. Like I just began to notice that every time there was something wrong with around me, like the shower wouldn't work, or food tasted bad, or the wait was too long at the doctor's office, or just something, anything that was wrong with life, I could trace it to some aspect of government involvement. And I found that intriguing. And it seemed, it gradually came to the conclusion that the government was ruining the world. It was ruining everything. And I felt the need to explain that and lay out how precisely that is true. So that's what drew me into writing more than anything else. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Who's an author that you would recommend people read, other than yourself, of course?
For technology, I really like Andreas Antonopoulos. For politics and history, I really like Auburn Herbert, who's just a great member of Parliament in Britain in the Victorian age. I really like him. For culture and ideas, I just can't stop being a fan of Oscar Wilde. For the human personality, I strongly suggest Sigmund Freud. Actually, I think Freud is an amazing and insightful writer. I mean, don't pick him up if you're not prepared to be challenged in everything you believe. And you can reject half of it if you want, or all of it, but you will definitely be shaken by Freud. And I love Ludovic Mises. I suggest that you read Mises in light of his personal biography, because I don't think it's good to read Mises as if you're reading the Bible. You should read Mises as if it's a human being writing at a particular time. In 1944, he believed this. In 1927, he thought that. In 1922, he believed this, and in 1956, he believed this, because his opinions evolved over time, and it's important to understand the overlay of his life with his work. Another thinker that you simply cannot avoid, and it's difficult to get into him, is Friedrich Hayek. Because he didn't have one masterwork, so you have to read a lot of different articles. Use of Knowledge in Society, Pretense of Knowledge, his paper on methodological individualism, all these things. But and also Hayek was not the kind of writer who laid down the canons of what you're supposed to believe. He didn't present doctrines, He was this highly speculative writer and was struggling all the time to come to an understanding and convey that to the reader. But once you kind of get to the Hayekian thing, you can't ever shake it, and it's fantastic. I would strongly suggest Hayek for anybody whose life has been really impacted by Rand. And I love Rand. I think Rand brings the romance to the capitalist story in a way in which nobody else did. In fact, I would actually say that she's underappreciated. I think she should be more appreciated for what she did. I wonder if any of us would even be here today without Rand. I mean, certainly there wouldn't have been a Rothbard without a Rand. But I would say epistemologically, and that's a big word, all it means is, how do we know and what do we know? Rand had too much certainty about everything that she said. In fact, she believed in certainty above all else. And I think that's a problem. I mean, the basis of statism is essentially certainty. I mean, the state is always certain about everything. So certain that it's willing to put a gun to your head to compel assent to what it believes you should do. And I think that's a fundamental problem with the state, is its lack of a Hayekian perspective. And so I think she was just basically wrong on this point. And so I think it's great to fall in love with Rand and her vision of the world, but it's very bad to take everything she says as gospel truth.
Okay, last question. Who is your favorite philosopher?
Wow. My favorite philosopher. Why, I almost said St. Thomas Aquinas, but I find actually that he annoys me more and more. So, as much as I read him, so I'm going to go back to Victorian period and the content. So I'm gonna split this between Adam Smith on one hand, whom I adore for particular reasons of time and place. I think Adam Smith, I mean, we are, as pro-capitalists, we are so fortunate to have him as a kind of the founder of the way we think, and I think both of his books are extremely important. But I also really, really like Carl Menger, who's often considered to be the founder of the Austrian School of Economics, but he was himself a great philosopher and a Thomist in many ways, but a Thomist improved by 400 years of development. So I do tend to return to both Adam Smith and to Carl Menger for a philosophical outlook. I mean, they were both economists, but you know, if you can't be a great economist without also having a philosophical outlook on life. Apart from that, of course, who isn't delighted by people like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer? You know, they're always wonderful, but I would never want to cite them as you know, gurus in my life in any sense.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for watching, and if you'd like to support videos like this, please check out the donation link inside the description.